We will start this presentation with a little video footage.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. What we have before us here is the new government of Europe, a government that with the Lisbon Treaty now has enormous powers, not just a foreign minister and embassies, not just the ability to sign treaties, but the ability now to use emergency powers to literally take countries over. And yet what we have heard from the European Parliament big group leaders this morning is the demand that you take even more powers and do it even more quickly. And perhaps it is worth reminding ourselves that this treaty that gives this Commission these powers does not have democratic legitimacy in the European Union at all. You ignored referendums, you denied referendums, and you bullied the poor Irish into voting for a second time. Now I am struck that the common denominator with this Commission is the sheer number of them that were communists or were very close to communism. Mr Barroso himself was a Maoist. Sim Kallas, far from being a student activist, was even a member of the Supreme Soviet, so a top-notch communist we have there. Baroness Ashton ran CND and still refuses to tell us whether she took money from the Communist Party of Great Britain. Now I could go on, but we'd be here for some time. But we have at least 10 communists in this Commission, and it must feel like a return to the good old days. There must be a certain nostalgia amongst the communists. Whilst 60 years ago an iron curtain fell across Europe, today we have the iron fist of the European Commission, and we have seen it with Article 121 and with Greece effectively being turned into a protectorate. Poor Greece, trapped inside the economic prison of the euro. Poor Greece, trapped inside the modern-day Volkerkerker, for which it appears there is no way out. What Greece needs, Mr Barroso, is devaluation, not sadomonetarism. Goodness knows what that is going to do to them. In 1968, we had the Brezhnev doctrine of limited sovereignty. Today, we have shared values. We have ever closer European Union and pooled sovereignty, and that is what you have used. But of course, it won't just be Greece, because the same is going to happen to Spain, to Portugal and to Ireland. 121 will be invoked with all of those. Mr Barroso, you said earlier we will stick to our course, and that means millions of people in Europe will be put through pain as you attempt to keep together this disastrous project that is the euro. It will fall to pieces, of that there can be no doubt, as surely as it did for Britain during the exchange rate mechanism in 1992. You can laugh, you can smile, it won't work, it can't work, it will fall to pieces, and as far as the peoples of Europe are concerned, the sooner it does, the better. We need democratic solutions to this. If you go on pushing your extreme Euro nationalism, this will lead to violence. We must vote against this Commission. We must put the future of Europe to people in every member state in free and fair referendums. Thank you.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Well, what else can I say? That's it. Now, the person you have just heard is Nigel Farage. He is a British member of the European Parliament and one of the leaders. He's the leader of the fraction in the European Parliament for a political party called UKIP, which is an abbreviation of United Kingdom's Independence Party. And you can get more of his European Parliament talks at the YouTube if you are interested. He is one of the very few voices of sanity that you can hear in the high-level European politics. He's not a Catholic, but regarding European Union and its policies, he is taking positions that I believe every Catholic should take. It might be a surprise for some of you, but a majority of European Catholics do support the process of European integration, and the final creation of a centralized European state, both laity and the clergy. How is it possible? What is it that makes those Catholics or other people that consider themselves politically conservative, some of them even traditionalist or with monarchist leanings, what is it that makes them sympathetic to an organization, to a supranational organization that's almost every recent decision takes away our God-given natural rights? We have seen many examples in the previous talks of John Venari, Christopher Ferrara, about the vices that are being present in the post-Soviet Union Russia. But frankly, some of them were not there before the dissolution of Soviet Union, but came afterwards from the West. And the same I can say about my own country, the former Czechoslovakia. John Venari mentioned the darling of West, Boris Yeltsin, who in 1993 decriminalized homosexuality. I have learned yesterday that in Canada, when you speak publicly against homosexuality, you say that homosexuality is a sin, or that the network of organized homosexuals, their organizations, that they are subversive or something like that to the society, that you get penalized, that it's criminal to say something publicly in Canada. Well, you can say it freely in Russia. In fact, the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, is well known for banning the gay parades in Moscow. The last attempt of the gay organizations to have a gay parade was that they had a plan for this year, for this spring. And Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, told a conference on education that he would ban, and he said it by these words, quote, "A gay parade cannot be called anything but a satanic act. We haven't permitted such a parade, and we won't permit it in the future. It's high time that we stop propagating nonsense discussions about human rights and bring to bear on them the full force and justice of the law." Well, I would be quite satisfied with that, with such a mayor, even though he comes from Russia. So maybe the picture is, is more complicated. It's not black and white. And I wouldn't dare to question the prevailing idea that the Russia is the only enemy we face if I didn't have the chance to experience or to live, to spend my life under two different political systems, two different regimes. I was born in 1967 in Prague, that is during communism. And when I was a teenager, I got involved in the underground, in the anti-communist movement, and not being raised a Catholic, I converted when I was 17 years old through the example of some of the priests who spent years and years in the prison. And following their example, I attended the underground masses and catechesis, and for that reason I was expelled from the university studies and many times interrogated, put into jail. And so this is my first life experience, living under communism, a system that I obviously hate. Now I live under a new regime, which is called liberal, secular liberal, under which I can so far travel. I can go to conferences on Fatima message, for example. I can even publish articles about it, but they are getting more and more, the views that I can publish or like to publish, they get ostracized. And there are signs coming that certain areas that we freely debate might become, at least in Europe, soon criminalized. So 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Western world, to which the people behind the Iron Curtain looked with admiration as a model to follow, resembles the presumably outdated socialist utopia day by day more and more. Although Our Lady in Fatima did not specify the errors of Russia, she didn't tell us what they specifically are, we can be sure what are the most destructive elements, features of the Soviet system. It's the secularism, atheism, socialism, artificial internationalism. This is what we usually associate with Soviet Union. But I can tell you that these features are very much present in the current European Union as well. You may have heard about Vladimir Bukovsky, who was a Russian political dissident who spent a total of 12 years in the Soviet prisons, labor camps, and in forced treatment psychiatric hospitals used by the government as special prisons. He was, in 1967, he was exchanged for a Chilean communist leader, Luis Corvelan, and since then he lives in Great Britain. And by the way, he's a member and supports the UKIP, the party of Nigel Farage that you saw at the beginning. In his famous speech delivered in Brussels in 2006, he stated the following, quote, "In January of 1989, for example, a delegation of the Trilateral Commission came to see Gorbachev. It included former Japanese Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone, former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, American banker David Rockefeller, and former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. They had a very nice conversation where they tried to explain to Gorbachev that Soviet Russia had to integrate into the financial institutions of the world, such as GATT, the IMF, and the World Bank. In the middle of it, Giscard d'Estaing suddenly takes the floor and says, 'Mr. President, I cannot tell you exactly when it will happen, probably within 15 years, but Europe is going to be a federal state, and you have to prepare yourself for that. You have to work out with us and the European leaders how you would react to that. How would you allow the other East European countries to interact with it or how to become a part of it? You have to be prepared,' close quote. This Valéry Giscard d'Estaing served from 2002 to 2003 as the president of the Convention on the Future of Europe. On the 29th October 2004, the European heads of state gathered here in Rome, approved and signed the European Constitution based on a draft strongly influenced by Giscard's work at the Convention. Although the European Constitution was rejected by French voters in May 2005, Giscard continued to actively lobby for its passage in other European Union states. Speaking at the London School of Economics on the 28th February 2006, he said that the rejection of the constitutional treaty by voters in France was a mistake that should be corrected, close quote. And it was. After it was rejected also by the Dutch voters in the Netherlands, Mrs. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, sent a letter to the presidents and the prime ministers of the EU member states, proposing a structural change, a reformulation of the document, of the Constitution, so it will not appear as a constitution. These are her words from the letter. Using different terminology without changing the legal substance. What she had in mind is not to lay down a specific text that would be clearly something like a constitution, but she proposed just to write down amendments to already existing European treaties, like the Maastricht Treaty, Treaty of Rome, Treaty of Amsterdam, of Nice. And this is the treaty that is known today as the Lisbon Treaty, that was signed in Lisbon in 2007. Well, I have a short quotation from that treaty, just that you see what the nations of Europe or what the national parliaments were voting upon. Today, if you look at the internet, you get the what they call the consolidated text, which is a new text. But when the parliaments were voting on Lisbon Treaty, they have what they call the non-consolidated text, that is the amendments to the existing treaties. So, and I've asked many of the Czech parliamentarians, did you understand what you were voting about in the parliament? And some of them frankly said, well, no, we didn't. We didn't even read it because it's unreadable. And I'll show you why. And so I apologize. I apologized especially to our excellent translators because you cannot translate something that doesn't give any meaning. So just let me read you a short part of a text that has more than 150 pages. Article 7 shall be amended as follows. A. Throughout the article, the word assent shall be replaced by consent. The reference to breach of principles mentioned in Article 6.1 shall be replaced by a reference to breach of the values referred to in Article 1a. The words of this treaty shall be replaced by of the treaties, and the word Commission shall be replaced by European Commission. B. At the end of the first sentence of the first subparagraph of paragraph 1, the words and address appropriate recommendations to that state shall be deleted. At the end of the last sentence, the words and acting in accordance with the same procedure may call on independent persons to submit within a reasonable time limit a report on the situation in the member state in question shall be replaced by and may address recommendations to it acting in accordance with the same procedure. Well, welcome to the Orwellian Newspeak of European Union. And this was 150 pages. So only like 3, 4, 5 occult figures in the highest echelons of European Union can understand what's here written on the paper. As we all know, this document was not put into referendums because it was said that this is just amending the existing treaties, with the only example, with the only exception, and that's Ireland, because Ireland has in its constitution a clause which says that any transfer of power from the nation state to a higher authority has to be authorized by a national referendum. So the Irish had to have the referendum, and when they arranged the referendum, the result was a resounding no. To which the European Commission President José Barroso, that's the one that Nigel Farage mentioned as a former Maoist, said, "The treaty is not dead. The treaty is well alive, and we will try to find a solution." Well, we all know what was the solution. The Irish had to repeat the referendum because they gave the wrong answer. So they were bullied into a repetition, and because they were threatened by various sanctions, for the second time, the referendum was accepted. The result is that today, 80 to 90% of the legislation that is voted upon in the nation-states parliaments emanates from Brussels in the form of various directives and other pieces of law. The parliaments, the national parliaments, do not usually even discuss the legislation because they are expected to approve it. And if it's not approved, the particular state is brought in front of the Court of Justice to be penalized. This was, for example, the case with the anti-discrimination law approved by the Czech parliament. The Czech government was defending the law, which presents non-existing rights as natural and potentially criminalizes opposition to, for example, homosexual behavior or other vices, on the basis that the Czech Republic would be forced to pay a huge amount of money in fines for not making it part of the Czech legal system. And you have plenty of other cases where the national parliaments just rubber stamp the EU directives. You may remember that some communist countries call themselves democratic, like the German Democratic Republic or the People's Republic of Romania or China. And we all know this is a sham. There is nothing democratic, no concern for the people at all in communist countries. Well, unfortunately, I have to say this just the same applies to European Union. Only just if we look at the structure, how it functions. Most of the power in EU is vested in European Commission, which comprises almost 25,000 employees. And these are not accountable to anyone whose power is delegated from national elections. And it is European Commission which is the only EU institution that has the legislative initiative. So usually when we say parliament, we associate parliaments with a body which makes laws. That's not the case with the European Parliament. The laws are being written in European Commission, which is this vast bureaucratic body. Then they are approved or voted upon in the Council of Ministers, and only then it goes to the European Parliament for approval. Here is another similarity between European Union and the Soviet Union system. In communist countries, de facto existed only one political party, the Communist Party. There were states where you had more political parties, that's true, but all of them had to subscribe to the fundamental tenets of the Marxist regime. The same is true in the EU Parliament. You can be voted into European Parliament on an anti-EU platform like Nigel Farage was, but you will not be allowed, according to the European Parliament procedures, to form your party group and will not receive any financial support. You will not get a staff. You will have no other support for your activities. And you will have special time restrictions to address the European Parliament. Like the USSR, the EU was created with little or no respect for transparent procedures. Much of what has happened within the EU has happened secretly. In their powerful exposé, The Great Deception, The Secret History of the European Union, published in 2003, British journalists Christopher Booker and Dr. Richard North, formerly a researcher inside the EU bureaucracy, aptly described the EU as a slow-motion coup d'etat, the most spectacular coup d'etat in history, close quote. The Belgian Prime Minister, Paul-Henri Spaak, known in Europe as Mr. Socialist, was responsible for convincing his fellow EU founding fathers that the most effective way to disguise their project's political purpose was to conceal it behind a pretense that it was concerned only with economic cooperation based on dismantling trade barriers, common market. The Euro-federalists cloak this destructive, revolutionary process under such code words as integration, harmonization, and convergence. It was actually a multitude of lies. The EU founders and their successors have been carrying forward nothing less than a brazen scheme of treason dressed up as economic trade policy. But the goal was more than that, a creation of a single European state. But those who favored it knew very well that people of Europe would never accept it. They would never willingly surrender their freedoms to become just a province in this vast European superstate. So they conspired to keep the truth from the people. That the common market was from the very beginning merely a tool for the future political integration is also obvious from the current euro crisis, when you analyze the crisis of the single European currency. A real currency reflects economic and political realities, but the euro was invented to serve political aspirations. The single currency was an icon of EU inclusion and equality. So a country like Greece, with a profoundly different economic, social, and cultural background than, let's say, Germany or Denmark, was treated for political purposes like the most thrifty and hard-working nation on earth, creating artificial imbalances and bubbles that are threatening the very existence of Eurozone or maybe EU itself. European Union has now only two options. Either let the Eurozone fall apart and return to the concept of Europe of free nations, or they will use the crisis for taking over even more control over the member states, forming what they call an economic government, a central economic government for European Union countries, with the power of setting up the common fiscal policy. I believe they will take the second option. I just cannot imagine that they will let their dream fall apart. Another striking similarity between the Soviet Union and European Union is of an ideological nature. And it concerns the concept of nation and people. When Our Lady spoke about the annihilation of nations, we think first and foremost about, and rightly so, their physical obliteration. But it can also have another secondary meaning. Their artificial neutralization in the melting pot of an ideological project called either the Soviet people or the European people. In the former Soviet Union, the citizens of individual countries were told that they should forget about their former national and ethnic identities. They were told, consider themselves members of the Soviet people, rather than citizens of Ukraine or Belarus or Uzbekistan or any other state. And exactly the same is happening in the EU superstate. European Union is intent on destroying nation states, suppressing national identities and borders, so that we can happily live in an always progressing supranational community of EU faithful. Brussels wants the member states, just to give you one of the latest examples, to implement a curricular reform in the schools all over European Union regarding history teaching. First, they want to have a new subject called the History of European Union that would be taught in all the public schools in all the member states. And then they also propose formation of textbooks with translations to the individual languages of the EU member states that would present the whole history of Europe from the perspective of European Union as the climax of the whole European history, so the goal of the progress and achieved by the European unification. Let me quote from a very interesting article written by John Lockland. He's an author of some very interesting books, including the Tainted Source, The Undemocratic Origins of European Idea. But this article doesn't come from the book. The article is titled Europe's Permanent Revolution. And in this article he quotes a German professor, Ulrich Beck, who teaches at the London School of Economics. Quote, "This historically unique form of international community cannot be explained in terms of the traditional concepts of politics and the state. Europe was neither a federation of states nor a federal superstate, but instead something which guarantees the coexistence of different ethnic, religious, and political forms of life across national borders based on the principle of cosmopolitan tolerance." And then he quotes Italian philosopher and a member of parliament, Gianni Vattimo. Like Beck, Vattimo believes that Europe has replaced socialism as a political utopia. Beck calls Europe the last remaining realistic political utopia. Last remaining. One assumes, because socialism has allegedly vanished, while Vattimo writes more explicitly, quote, "The European ideal is a valid, perhaps the only valid substitute for the Marxist project for the construction of a disalienated society." Close quote. Vattimo goes on. Europe as a project of political construction which is founded solely on free adhesion of citizens and of states with equal rights is today the most visible manifestation of an anti-naturalist policy. By anti-naturalist, he means that is not based on any form of heredity or nationhood, no blood or soil. As such, he writes, this is a Marxist concept. There is no doubt that the cosmopolitanism, which so excites Beck, Vattimo, and others, has Marxist antecedents. Cosmopolitanism was one of Marxism's most important tenets, encapsulated by the slogan, "The worker has no country." Marx and Engels wrote excitedly in the Communist Manifesto of how world capitalism would destroy family and nation and thereby usher in world socialism. They wrote, and I'm quoting now from the Communist Manifesto, "The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed. In place of the old local and national self-seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible." Close quote. However, there is a deeper sense in which Europe's permanent institutional revolution is being deliberately carried over by old Marxists into Europe's political reality. And it is a sense which comes from the very heart of darkness of Marxism-Leninism. For various authors, Europe is desirable precisely because it is what they call polymorphic and multifunctional, because it has no center and no summit, because nothing is fixed. Everything is in a state of flux. You will find many examples of this dialectics, to which Lockland so aptly refers, in the way European Union treats marriage, family, and human life in general. I was quoting that press release regarding the homosexual marriage approved in Portugal. That is, the marriage or family meant only what marriage or family meant only 50 years ago means something else today. because everything is socially and culturally conditioned, and things have no fixed nature. Although Soviet Union disappeared, and communism allegedly too, the contemporary power structures not only absorbed many of its human shakers and puppets, but also its radical ideas and policies, as I have tried to show and prove. Now we can come back to the question that I raised at the beginning of my talk. How is it possible that a political project that counters in almost every possible respect the basic principles of a Catholic social order finds its support among many so-called conservatives, Christians, Catholics? Let's don't forget that the largest political fraction in the European Parliament are not the socialists, liberal Democrats, Greens. It's the Christian Democrats, those who proclaim themselves to be inspired by Christianity. We can also recall the support provided to the EU integration process by the Pope John Paul II and many other members of the Catholic hierarchy. To my knowledge, in all the new member states that joined EU during the last 10-15 years, the local bishops' conferences gave their full support to European unification and called upon the faithful to vote in favor of it. The member states have their own ecclesiastical kind of organization where they send bishops from each member state, and they meet every year to discuss all kinds of issues which they propose to European Commission, and it's always something on poverty and immigration and environment. And I went through those documents. There is not a single document on abortion, on population control, on homosexual lifestyle and things like that. So how is it possible? Well, I think that maybe it's just a partial answer. I'm sure there are more angles from which we can view it, or judge it. But among the founding fathers are some figures that claim to be Christian or Catholic. And because of that, those Christians of today consider the European Union project as something worthwhile. And I have one particular person in mind when I say this. He played a leading role in the first phases of the European integration process. And up until today, he has a very high reputation in the so-called conservative circles in Europe. And his name is Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. Kalergi or Kalergi, depends on. His father was living for a short time in England, so after that, he called himself Kalergi. He was of an aristocratic origin. Did anyone hear about him? Is it a name that you would recognize? Okay. His father was an Austrian diplomat who spoke 16 languages and spent his whole life commuting from place to place. And his mother was a Japanese. And his lineage goes through many ethnic identities, from Greek, Polish, Norwegian, French, German, British. So then, when he was dealing with the question who he is, he decided not to side with any of the individual nationhood or ethnicity, but became a professed cosmopolitan. When he was a boy and lived in Pobieżowice, which is a small town in southwest Bohemia, his father took him every Sunday to Holy Mass. Not because his father was a devout Catholic, but mainly for cultural and social reasons. Whittaker Chambers, who wrote about Coudenhove-Kalergi and the family, mentions that on every Good Friday, as the liturgy came to the exhortation, Oremus et pro perfidis Judaeis, that is, let us also pray for the faithless Jews, the old count rose and walked out of the church in the protest against this supposed expression of anti-Semitism. The environment in which little Richard was raised was not only very cosmopolitan, but also syncretistic. Among the frequent family guests were devotees of various Eastern cults, Muslims, the local rabbi came often, but they didn't invite many Christians. Richard studied in Vienna, where in 1922 he joined the Masonic lodge Humanitas and married a famous Jewish actress. In the same year as he entered Humanitas, he co-founded the first movement for United Europe called Pan-Europa. This organization is still around. Coudenhove Kalergi was, according to his own words, influenced by Stoic philosophy, namely by Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Caesar, whom he considered a first modern man and the founder of Europe. In some of his writings, he mentions Christianity as a necessary ingredient of the future unified Europe, which I believe plays a role in the support he gathered from the various Christian circles. But Coudenhove was never a Christian in the sense that he would believe in what God revealed. He did not believe that our Lord, Jesus Christ, was God. Nevertheless, he mentions Christ positively in his book Hero or Saint, published in 1927, where he focuses on three figures on which he wants to build the pan-European Union. The first one is Socrates, whom he calls the prophet of individualism. The second one is Nietzsche, who is supposed to be the prophet of German heroism. And the third person is Jesus Christ, whom he calls the prophet of Jewish socialism. In his important work, Pan-Europa, published in 1923, he presents four phases of European integration: the creation of Pan-European Conference, adoption of binding agreements about borders, customs union, and finally, the creation of United States of Europe. He calls for one parliament, one government, one court of justice, one currency, one flag, one anthem. During this process, he relies on the existence of the individual ethnic or national identities, but when the final goal is achieved, the borders between member states are to be abolished and a single European nation created. And this can be successfully achieved only if and when the loyalties to individual European nations are dissolved and replaced by the ideological allegiance to the single European people. What are the means that he proposes for achieving that end? Quote, if the nations get sufficiently mixed up, their homogeneity will eventually erode. Then he comes with a eugenic project of breeding new human beings. And the mission is entrusted into the hands of international socialism. Quote, socialism, which was born through the process of destroying the old aristocracy and which promoted equality among men, will achieve its apex in the diversity of peoples. His highest mission is in social eugenics, that is to liberate humanity from unjust inequality and bring them through equality and destruction of all pseudo-aristocracies back to inequality, this time just, that is to the creation of new aristocracy. Close quote. He wrote about the ideal of new aristocracy and new man quite openly in his work Der Adel, published in a book whose title I just love, Praktischer Idealismus, the practical idealism. If anyone follows German philosophy, this is a typical German concept. The man, and I'm quoting from the book, the man of the future will be of mixed race. Today's races and classes will gradually disappear owing to the vanishing of space, time, and prejudice. The type of the man of future in the contemporary Europe is the Russian, the crossbred of a Slav, Finnish, and Tartar, because he is from among all European nations the least monoracial, and represents a type of man with colorful spirituality, wide, rich, and all-embracing soul, close quote. He continues, the Eurasian Negroid race of the future, similar in its appearance to the ancient Egyptians, will replace the diversity of peoples with the diversity of individuals, close quote. I'm not making this up. You can get the book in your library, read it by yourself, although you cannot buy it, for example, in Germany, because it's banned. And you will not find it on the internet, at the webpage of Pan-Europa, of the Pan-European movement, which is understandable. The question is how this discrepancy between what the Pan-Europa officially teaches and the writings of their founder, where does the discrepancy originate? Was the Pan-European movement hijacked? Or was praktischer Idealismus only meant for the few in the inner circles? And all the talk about Christian values and democracy is only empty rhetoric. Here's another interesting quotation. Until Europe has its spiritual aristocracy, it is necessary to support and strengthen our democratic government. Today, democracy is merely a protection from chaos, but its main goal is to bring forth from within itself the new aristocracy. The new form of being and new morality in Europe can be finally realized only through some dictator, close quote. Kalergi was aware that his project will not be supported from below, from ordinary people. That is why he needed to create a new cosmopolitan elite capable of fulfilling this dream. He was dissatisfied with the old aristocracy because it was too rooted in particular places and traditions and kept alive loyalties that present obstacles to the creation of a single European nation. So who shall form this new aristocracy that Kalergi keeps talking and writing about? Quote, following the death of Christianity in Europe, we face a new era of barbarism. The Christian instincts of Europeans are too weak. That is why Jews, with their set of social instincts, represent a happy fulfillment of this gap. Close quote. Another quote, instead of destroying European Jewry, Europe, against its own will, refined and educated this people into a future leader nation through this artificial selection process. No wonder that this people that escaped ghetto prison developed into a spiritual nobility of Europe. Therefore, a gracious providence provided Europe with a new race of nobility by the grace of spirit. This happened at the moment when Europe's feudal aristocracy became dilapidated, and thanks to Jewish emancipation, close quote. Obviously, his views about the role of Jews in Europe led him to leave Europe in 1940, and then he lived in the United States. From 1942, he taught at New York University, where he was appointed to teach history. He kept promoting his plans for Europe on American soil and established close working relations with Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill's celebrated speech of 19 September 1946 to the academic youth in Zurich commended, quote, the exertions of the Pan-European Union which owe so much to our beloved Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, close quote. In 1955, he proposed the Beethoven's Ode to Joy as the music for the European anthem, a suggestion that the Council of Europe took up 16 years later. It's also interesting to look into the financial aspect of Pan-European Union. I am quoting from Kalergi's autobiography, quote, at the beginning of 1924, we received a call from Baron Louis de Rothschild, or Rothschild, I don't know how to pronounce Rothschild. One of his friends, Max Warburg from Hamburg, has read my book and wanted to get to know us. To my great surprise, Warburg spontaneously offered us 60,000 gold marks to tide the movement over for its first 3 years. Max Warburg, who was one of the most distinguished and wisest men that I have ever come into contact with, had a principle of financing these movements. He remained sincerely interested in pan-Europe for his entire life, close quote. Do you recognize the name of Max Warburg? It was he who co-arranged the famous Lenin's trip in that sealed train from Switzerland to Russia with this 5 to 6 million US dollars in gold to stage the revolution. And those of you who come from the United States surely know that Max's brother Paul was one of the chief architects and prime movers in establishing the Federal Reserve System. Coudenhove-Kalergi is still held in great esteem, despite his confused, racist, and elitist teachings, which have certain similarities to Nazi ideology. His idea of artificial racial and ethnic amalgamation finds its practical expression in the decades-long policy of liberal immigration and enforced multiculturalism in schools, workplaces, and media. European Union, contrary to the wishful thinking of many Catholics, has nothing to do with the old Christendom. We may recall the failed attempt to include a specific mention of God and Christianity in the preamble to the EU Constitution. In 1992, the President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, called for a soul for Europe, arguing that if Brussels was unable to inject a spiritual dimension into the EU, it would fail to command the allegiance of its citizens. But he or anyone else never suggested that the European Union should be ensouled by the Christian faith. On the contrary, there are many examples from the recent past that the soul of Europe will not be, or is not supposed to be Catholic. From the political fall down of the Italian commissioner Rocco Buttiglione for calling homosexual act a sin and questioning the goodness of being an unwed mother, to the recent ban of crucifixes in Italian schools, we are being assured that ideas forming this new united Europe are not of a Catholic origin. Let me finish my talk with quoting from a communique of a French Federation of Masonic Lodges dated April 11, 2008. Quote, this is a communique issued after the delegation met with José Manuel Barroso, the president of the European Commission. This meeting constitutes a major event regarding the place of Freemasonry in the construction of Europe. This place was underscored not only by the interest and attentiveness that President Barroso showed to the delegation and the time he accorded them, but also by the commitments he made to the values espoused by Freemasonry, its positions and its opinions on subject of concern. The delegation received assurances from President Barroso of his attachment to the spirit of laïcité and to the principle of separation of religion from the state. The delegation stressed the importance of the Enlightenment in the history of Europe, a dimension to be taken into account at least equally with its religious roots, and certainly more closely tied to the roots of antiquity. Finally, a principle of communication between Masonic orders and the services of the European Commission to be used whenever needed was decided upon. Thus, the French Federation will propose in the near future a recommendation concerning the principle of emancipation that ought to form the basis of all European education systems, in direct relation to a recognition of the contribution of Enlightenment and Freemasonry to the common culture of the peoples that compose Europe, and in accordance with the principles of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Close quote. Your Excellencies, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, the real historical Europe is being replaced by a Masonic utopia with totalitarian aspirations. And I do not believe this is a result of some political maneuvering during the last few years, but this is from the very beginning when the idea of the post-Christian, or rather anti-Christian, European common identity was forged, step by step, first as an economic unit, then political unit. Now we have a spiritual unit with all three levels of this unity in contradiction to what Europe was when she was Catholic. The fate of Europe, as of the world in large, depends on the fulfillment of Our Lady's request to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. When this happens, not only Russia will be liberated from its errors and their bitter fruit, but other European nations as well. European Union will vanish, and Christian, Catholic Europe will be reborn. Deo volente, may this happen soon. Thank you.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended.